Hey team, good afternoon. It's been a great day listening to the various perspectives of criminology that have been presented throughout the day. My name is Heather Karambelas. In 2009, I retired from the US Army as an intelligence officer, and I currently work as an assistant professor in the Department of Joint, Interagency, and Multinational Operations for the US Army's Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I'm a student right now in a Doctor of Strategic Intelligence program through the American Public University System, and I'm representing on behalf of them today. I will be discussing some recent research I conducted in order to consider whether or not personal ethics can be a predictor for the likelihood that someone would release national security information. In other words, leak national security information. Thank you for joining me for this session and for taking your time to find more out about this afternoon. And if you have any questions throughout, if you could capture those in the chat bar, Ms. Moss can capture those and present those at the end. Or by all means, if you have questions throughout, then bring those up and we will talk about them as they come up. This is the agenda for my discussion. I'll be presenting some definitions to consider and some background questions about why I believe this research is important and valuable, and why the issue of insider threats and national security information is a challenge. Then I will briefly discuss the construction of my study. There are 4 cases specifically that I will talk about to describe different leakers who have been successfully at least indicted for their crimes. 3 of the 4 have actually been prosecuted for unauthorized disclosure of the national security information. And then these study findings help hopefully illuminate new ways to understand the insider threats and those who leak national security information. And I will discuss some basic conclusions that I took away from the research and propose some recommendations for future research. I undertook this as an initial study that will hopefully help shape more research by me and potentially by others in the future. So that's where I'm my starting out point for this. Please feel free, again, if you ask questions, if you type them in the chat box, or if you raise your hand to ask questions, then Ms. Moss, who is our moderator for this afternoon, can capture those and present those questions later in the discussion or throughout if you need to stop me and ask a question. Okay, so some key definitions that I wanted to identify early are these ethical constructs that I use to base my study on. So deontology is the first one. Deontology is a duty ethic. That means that it speaks to the rules and obligations that people should follow. Things like don't murder, don't steal, don't cheat. Those are rules that typically people understand as rules of how to be. And if you are following that duty ethic, then you are doing the right things because it is the rule and because it is the right thing to do. So it is a rightness in your action. Okay. The next ethical construct is consequentialism, and that is kind of the opposite. So if you think of deontology as rightness in your actions, you could think of consequentialism as choosing the rightness of the outcome. So trying to determine by your actions what will be the best outcome is following that consequentialist kind of perspective. And when we're talking about it in this context, we're talking about these 2 extremes where we have deontology on the one hand, where it's rule following, strict adherence to the policies because it is the right thing to do, to follow those rules and to not leak national security information. And on the other hand, you have this consequentialism where I don't believe, subjectively, I don't believe that it is necessarily the right thing to do. I think it depends on what the outcome is of when I release that information. So from a utilitarian perspective of consequentialism, that would mean that maybe my personal goals, so maybe money, maybe spying for a foreign government, maybe to get a date and to boost my ego is more important than following the rules. Or from a pluralist perspective, this is where we get into those whistleblower kind of activities where I believe it is in the interest of, the good of the nation, the good of the people, the good of whatever I subjectively insert into that, and believe that that is more important than my duty and obligation to protect national security information. So I wanted to start out with the foundation of what those definitions are, because those really shaped my how I expressed the study criteria and how I applied the study to different cases of national security information being leaked to the public. Okay, so some background information on this. Why do we study insiders to begin with? Insiders hold a special place of trust. They are in trusted positions because they are a part of the organization. They each have unique access to systems. They have unique access to information and understanding of how organizations work and why the organization does what it does. And so when you have a threat or a vulnerability from these people who are within your organization, it requires a special way of understanding them. Like, you have to reach out and identify that specifically, because in general, we trust our teammates and we trust those people that we accept into our organizations. So it's important to consider that when we give people a trusted position, that they could use that against us and create a unique vulnerability within the organization. So that is why we study insiders deliberately and separately from other threats. When you consider ethics, it is my belief that most insiders, or most cases in research, demonstrate that most insiders do not join the organization with the intent to cause damage from within. There are some notable exceptions, but because that is the case, there are points within that person joining the organization, that person receiving access to information, that person choosing to release that information. There are touch points at which you can make some predictions and hopefully use those predictions to prevent the insider from releasing information. And that is why we consider insiders, and as an ethical challenge, understanding those insiders' personal ethics can help you to determine whether or not they are going to hold the obligations of protecting national security as more important at those key touch points, or whether their ethics will drive them down the path of it's somehow in the greater subjective good that they release that information. So that's why we study insiders, and that is why it's important to understand ethical constructs at a personal level. And then I believe that this understanding can help not only to bring about a way to identify potential threats, but also to develop and put in place systems to identify those potential threats and prevent access. So if we had a survey that would determine if you were likely to release national security information, then that survey could be used for clearance granting and for determining if you were going to have access to national security information to begin with. So all of those things are why understanding this situation can help. And I wanted to highlight here that my hypothesis for the research is that people who follow the ethical construct other than deontology, so remember that deontology is the rules-based, doing the right thing for the right reasons. If you are other than that, the farther away you are from that rules-based ethic, the more likely you are to release national security information, or the more likely you are to subject that decision to your own criteria. So instead of strictly going by what the rule is, you might supplant that rule with your own justification for why information should be released. So I think that's important, and that's an important factor of my research that is the hypothesis that I was trying to understand better. Okay, so the study construct was fairly in-depth, and yet it was a very small study. So I'm hoping in the future to expand on this study with a greater number of cases, because there are definitely a lot of cases of people who have leaked and released national security information. So this is a qualitative research design, which means that I did not conduct an experiment. I captured the information and I did my best to describe the factors that were relevant to this information as it came up in my research. So it is a qualitative research design, and I used a multiple case study methodology. So 4 cases, to be specific, were identified as relevant for their variety and for their applicability to the question of ethics. I hope that this research will support future research by me or potentially by anyone who's listening here, and this sparks an interest. I may choose to do this for my dissertation. I haven't formally settled on a dissertation topic, but this is interesting to me, and I think it definitely has the potential to develop into a dissertation length research project. It is considered instrumental in that the research design is written in such a way that it promotes policy recommendations. So when you say you're doing instrumental analysis, that means it is instrumental in making change. So my goal is that ultimately, through better understanding of insider threats, their ethics, and identifying a potential way to prevent these attacks or to prevent access to information by people who are likely to leak it, that you can support some policy recommendations by that. So that's part of the ethical design. I did use quotes and testimony from court cases. So official documents, as well as interviews through journalists, psychologists, different ways to identify keywords that would lead me to differentiate an ethical construct. So throughout, when I ascribe an ethic to the people we are talking about, it is because I took court cases and transcripts and identified keywords that led me to that conclusion. I did make an assumption that the ethics can be considered on a spectrum. If you think of a line where deontology is on one side and consequentialism is on another side, then you have that spectrum. That is not exactly how ethics works, but I use that kind of as a grounding philosophy for this discussion. I think it's helpful as far as visualizing the structure of ethics to think of it that way. But again, that's an assumption, so I would have to go back and potentially refine how I think about that. And then this research doesn't necessarily make predictions about causation, but it does seek to better understand the insider threats and how they use national security information for their own purposes against what is defined in laws and policies to protect that information. And then finally, my research, the research that we're talking about today, does not consider at all the numerous cases of unintentional releases of national security information. So one of our greatest problems in Department of Defense, as well as businesses across the board really, is in protecting information from unintentional release, like computer hackers, malicious code, spillage from operating on one system or another mistakenly, putting a CD or a thumb drive that's classified into an unclassified system. All of those cases are unintentional spillage. And what we're really talking about here and trying to prevent are those cases where it is malicious and intentional. So I just wanted to lay out the study construct and those specific issues that are relevant to how I constructed this study. I selected different situations to explain the phenomena of the insider threat and how it related to ethics. So I just went into the numerous cases that are out there and selected individual cases that I thought would represent broadly a lot of different kinds of ethical constructs. I was actually surprised that when it came down to it, there was not a lot of variety in the end about their motivation, although how these cases came about and how the person released information was very different. But in the end, it was really subverting the obligations to protect information with their own perspective of gain, something to be gained by not something to be gained by releasing that information. And then I only selected cases that were available in public venue so that there would be familiarity for a common reference point for discussion, as well as the opportunity to use quotes and that testimony to do my coding. Okay, so the first case I wanted to talk about was Chelsea Manning. And Chelsea Manning was a US Army intelligence analyst who was convicted of numerous crimes and unauthorized release of national security information, espionage, release to foreign governments. He provided a tremendous amount of Department of State and US Army and US Department of Defense information to WikiLeaks in order to undermine the military's operations in Iraq. She believed that the US Army was doing wrong, that we were not acting in accordance with how we portray ourselves to be, and the operations that we were conducting were not what she believed they should be. So she believed that it was more valuable to release that information to provide transparency to the public rather than to protect the information that she was obligated to protect by her job and by the non-disclosure agreements that she had signed as a member of the military. So that was a specific challenge with Chelsea, and I perceive this ethic to be related to consequentialism, and specifically pluralism in this case, because they were really looking at the greater good. So the greater good, in this soldier's opinion, was to release national security information in an effort to stop the US Army from conducting operations that she felt were unethical or not in keeping with what we portray to be in our worldview. So there was originally a whistleblower claim, that she was doing what was right for the greater number of people in providing transparency of Department of State operations and military operations in an effort to keep us from doing what we were doing. The next case I wanted to talk about is Edward Snowden. It's probably very familiar to a lot of you. Edward Snowden is currently an asylum seeker of foreign governments because he is under indictment in absentia, and there are both civil and criminal cases still pending against him for espionage, crimes against the United States national security infrastructure, releasing information to foreign governments. He actually provided a tremendous amount of information to both the several newspapers, as well as to WikiLeaks. So the information that he provided was related to the National Security Agency's domestic programs. So what he considered to be domestic spying, and he considered that to be a violation of First Amendment freedom of speech and Fourth Amendment freedom against search and seizure, unlawful search and seizure. And because of that, he believed that those rules and his personal belief about the government being transparent and what they do domestically, and that the National Security Agency was wrong for enacting these programs, all of those provided a consequentialist justification in which Edward Snowden claimed that he was serving the greater good through providing this information to the public in order to make policy changes. He really believed that in providing this information, he was meeting the greater good. So that is, again, a consequentialism kind of ethic and pluralist, because he's looking at the greater good for the greater number of people in how he applied his personal ethics to the situation of identifying something was wrong at the National Security Agency, and then going about releasing information on those programs and activities to the public through WikiLeaks and through the news. Okay, the next case is Henry Kyle Fries. He is a DIA analyst who began a relationship with a journalist, and in order to, at first, to get money, she convinced him to provide top secret information about Pentagon activities and DIA reports, Defense Intelligence Agency reports, to her to as like leads to stories. And then as this became more common, they started dating. And so to boost his ego with him, to boost his her feelings towards him, he continued to provide top secret information, at one point even agreeing to give information to other journalists to boost her career and to make her look good to her fellow journalists. He was fairly open about this, actually. Like, he would provide the information to her, she would write an article, he would tweet the article out on, retweet the article that came out on Twitter, so that he was increasing the number of people reading the information that he had originally provided to this journalist girlfriend he was with. And that was really it. So money, and for his ego and for these relationships, he was willing to undermine protection of national security information. This case is kind of unique in that there was nothing linking him to being a spy. There was no effort to make it out like he was committing espionage. He was directly just providing information to make his girlfriend look good, and did not really think about the consequences to national security in providing that information. And so that is consequentialism still, because he was more concerned with the outcome, making his girlfriend look good, making some money, boosting his own ego. And yet it is not pluralist. He wasn't out for the greater good for the most number of people. He was out for the greater good for himself. And that's a utilitarian perspective in which he believed that his rights are more valuable. His right to money, a positive dating life, positive relationships is more valuable than his obligation to protect national security information. So that is our third case. And our final case is Brian Minkyu Martin. He was a Navy intelligence specialist. He stole national security information from his job. He was working with special forces and believed that he had a long career of potential spying for China ahead of him. So he took that information and sought out someone to sell it to, and he sold that information to someone he believed to be a Chinese spy. Luckily for us, that person was not a Chinese spy, but was a counterintelligence agent who was able to arrest Martin and prevent him from actually putting that top secret information into the hands of China, as was his intent. So he very clearly wanted money. His ego was kind of bound up in this. So this was, again, consequentialism through his discussions. One of his quotes is actually that he was blinded by greed. He walked into work every day, looked at the type of information that he had access to, and recognized a value in that other people would want and that people would pay for. And so in that vein, he sought somebody who he thought would pay the most money, and went about pursuing efforts to spend to spend that capital that he had in national security information and to get back money. So from that perspective, it was consequentialist again, and again utilitarian, because this was all about the greater good for Brian Minkyu Martin. It wasn't about the greater good for the nation. It wasn't about fulfilling his obligations or following that duty ethic. It was about how can the outcome of this be in favor of the individual, and that was the actions that he took. Okay, so overall, the study found that there is a way, by coding different phrases in the in testimony, by coding different phrases captured by journalists, there is a way to determine what motivated someone towards taking action. And in understanding their motivations, we are able to ascribe an ethical construct towards that, and then better understand which ethics are more likely to result in somebody leaking national security information. So in doing that, I think the study was positive. It reinforced my interpretation or my beliefs. So I do need to go back and conduct a study where it's greater number of people, more variation of cases, and have some other researchers help to support my understanding to make sure that I'm not just using, applying some kind of confirmation bias to have the answers turn out the way that I want. So that is a challenge of this study, but it is something that I believe the study definitely demonstrated that it is possible to move forward with a greater study and try to determine these personal ethics and how they might influence the likelihood to leak national security information. And then because of that, I believe that there is reason to hold out hope that through a greater number of cases and through greater application of more researchers to at least review findings and review cases that are selected, and through some of those bias reducing activities, that you could do a greater research process and really better understand how ethics can be used as a determinant if somebody is more likely to leak national security information, and then maybe develop policies to prevent people from having access to that information if they are likely to leak information or not. So this is all about kind of refining a method for preventing insider attacks in the form of leaking national security information. And I think the findings demonstrate that it is possible, and just with more refining of the study and with more cases, I think that would prove to be the case. So the conclusion is that personal ethics drive behavior, and potentially those ethics can be analyzed to prevent insiders who are likely to leak classified information from gaining that access to begin with. So that is the goal of this research, and I think that the research demonstrates that that is in fact the case. For future research, I would propose, again, a number of additional cases. So there are hundreds of cases that have been prosecuted as far as wide-scale leaks and unauthorized release of national security information. So gaining more cases wouldn't be a challenge, but I think that that would be the next logical step for future research, as well as investigating the challenge of whether or not releasing national security information could be the right choice. So this kind of goes back to that whistleblower perspective that that Edward Snowden demonstrated, in which a lot of people, society in general, a lot of people agree that the National Security Agency overstepped their boundaries, and that those oversteps would not have come to light if Snowden had not released that information. So although there are a lot of indictments against him, and a lot of criminal aspects are pending against him, it is still worth considering if the obligations under protecting the Bill of Rights, for people to speak openly and to not be violated by unauthorized search and seizure, if those rights and obligations, and your obligation as part of national security to protect those, can be in conflict with the rights and obligation to protect national security information. So I think that would be a valuable, at least aspect of a future study, would be to consider if sometimes leaking information is the right choice under that duty ethic, that there are cases where you could say this is the right thing for the right reason, and that would still be a deontological perspective. And then ultimately, it would be valuable to develop an experiment where you were conducting surveys, first to determine personal ethics, and then to determine how those personal ethics apply to likelihood to leak information. So it would really be like a series of two question forms, two questionnaires, in which you randomize, your people, and ask questions about like what their personal ethics are, using forced pair choices, and then using a separate questionnaire to determine, okay, now if your family was threatened, would you release national security information? Would you release it for money? Would you release it because you thought it was the right thing to do? Would you release it if your organization was doing something wrong that you disagreed with? So all those kinds of questions could be incorporated into determining if there was a correlation between those ethical constructs that are determined in the first kind of survey and likelihood to leak information that could be determined in the second type of survey. So I think that those are some potentials for future research that I would be interested in following up on. And if I go forward with this as a dissertation, those are some of the ideas that I have in my mind. I am eager to hear if anyone has other ideas, or if something that I've talked about so far is different from how you understand something, or to initiate that discussion. So that concludes the formal part of the briefing. I see that there are 2 items in chat.
Yes. So I can read those questions to you.
Okay.
The first question we had early on from Michelle Watts. Hi, Michelle. Do you define malicious in your study? Curious if someone who believes they are doing something to promote the greater good could be described as malicious.
I did not specifically. Other reports and other research has defined what is malicious, but I suppose for my research, it's more important to say intentional rather than malicious. So an intentional release of national security information versus a malicious release of national security information.
And next we have a question from Leslie Ann Wilson. She asks regarding utilitarianism, what is the rationale that you've used for placing utilitarianism as a highly negative ethic, or on the linear construct you are using or is the linear construct you're using problematic? For example, utilitarianism and Bentham forms the basis for much of the Western world's police forces and is considered a highly normative ethnic. Could I ask your thoughts on this?
Yes. I selected consequentialism in general because it is considered the foil, the opposite or opposing to deontology, wherein you have choices. So if you consider a deontological ethic as rules-based and constructed through duty and obligation to do the right thing regardless of the outcome, then you could consider consequentialism or utilitarianism as the as what happens when somebody inserts a choice. What do they believe to be the right thing to do, or what will achieve the right outcome? So I believe that it is absolutely right for policing to use a utilitarianism, because a police officer is always looking for the greater good, right? So you're going to try to minimize injuries in an accident. You're going to try to minimize harm in different cases. So that makes sense in that construct. What I'm talking about here is if your personal ethics allow you to subvert your obligations to protect national security information with something that you believe to be a greater good, then that would be the challenge. So it's not really that utilitarianism is bad. It's just in this context of leaking national security information, I believe that it demonstrates that consequentialism and utilitarianism demonstrate that that the person is making a subjective choice rather than following the rules that are set forth to protect national security information.
And we have a follow-up question from Michelle Watts. You mentioned using public cases as opposed to classified or just highly publicized cases. I think, what do you mean by public?
Okay. So for this specifically, with only choosing 4 cases, I wanted some recognizability in the cases. So I used cases that were kind of highlighted by national newspapers that I thought people would have a familiarity with, so that when I'm talking about these concepts, more people would be able to specifically relate and understand what was going on in the background of the case, because I wanted to focus on either the prosecution or those specific details that made the case unique from an ethical perspective.
And I have a question of my own. So you did mention some very public cases and very intentional, greed and, higher, more thoughts. What about those incidents did you turn up any in your research where people unintentionally leaked national security information?
There are a lot of cases, and that's really, when those come up, I excluded them from my research, because those don't demonstrate, those are typically a mistake in either protocols or a mistake in how we are following the procedures of the technical classifications of the systems that we operate on, or somebody clicked on a link in email, and those unintentional cases are very damaging. They're damaging to businesses and they're damaging to the Department of Defense. But we have an information infrastructure network protection organization that deals specifically with protecting our information from unintentional release. So, and that's called our DODIN. And because of that organization and their responsibilities to protect information from unintentional release, I really didn't focus on that at all. But I don't have the number off the top of my head, but unintentional release costs the most physical money in mitigation and recovery of almost any threat that we face on a year-to-year basis.
So yes, it sounds like a lot of that unintentional release is going to be done by, you know, phishing scams and hackers on our systems. Any, is it a low percentage, any of that, of people just, you know, speaking to family or friends and basically loose lips, sinking chips?
Um, well, even if that would still be intentional, right? So even if it's a bad idea, or if you're not intending to do harm, like with in the case of Kyle Freese, he was not intending to do harm. He just wanted to boost, the impression that his girlfriend had of him, and to maybe make some money on the side. So there was not that espionage level, to the case that was brought against him, and there was not that accusation of him being a spy. It was just bad judgment in releasing that information. So there is for sure an aspect of loose lips sink ships, but what we find as more of a challenge are things like use of thumb drives, like Bradley Manning at the time, now Chelsea Manning, was able to walk in with read-write CDs that had Mariah Carey, labels on them, and walk out with a lot of classified information, top secret information on Department of State programs and military operations that he was able to just upload to WikiLeaks. So there is a technological aspect with CDs, with USB, the use of USB ports and cables. In the future, there's a lot of concern about iWatches, in areas where there's classified, or Google Glass or Google Contacts that will allow you to, take a picture by blinking your eyes, or do these different technological advances that would allow for intentional release to happen more easily. A personal example: when I was a trainer for a military unit that was going into Iraq, and we presented them with a challenge of, okay, what if somebody loses a thumb drive that you're using to pass all this classified information? What do you do? And at the time, people were so shocked that that might happen. And then when I went to Iraq to follow up with that unit 6 months later, and I'm sitting with them, and they by that time, 6 months later, they had to put a guard process in place that had 5 eyes on laundry before somebody could turn in a laundry bag. They had to go through a process where 5 people were reviewing that, because they had garbage bags weekly of thumb drives being turned in by the laundry people, or being sold on the streets of Tikrit. So it's a real challenge with the technology. And following that, we stopped allowing unique USB drives to be used on government computers. So our policies had to evolve to not just because of the intentional release of information, but because people were just sloppy with their technical hygiene, and not doing the right things to protect day-to-day information that they were working with.
Oh, thank you. Do we have any other questions? We've had some good ones today. Thank you.
I see 2 more in chat. I don't know if we've already covered those.
Yes, I think we're down to it.
Okay.
One thing that I was also just thinking, but I'm guessing, I mean, when it comes to national security, it doesn't have any aspect, but what about like Freedom of Information Act? Are there any, how does that kind of work with some of these, information? Is that it's someone's, putting in a request for that, and do they find, accidentally get sent national security information or something like that?
Ideally, no.
Yes.
The one of the challenges that we have, at least in the Department of Defense, is in kind of overclassification of the information that we use. So when you use a an FOUO, for official use only, or a CUI label, which is controlled unclassified information, which is what we've evolved towards now. So if you have a CUI label or an FOUO label, then supposedly those things are supposed to be prohibited from release under Freedom of Information Act. But what you run into is a challenge of people will use that as the standard, like email release, and then it becomes a challenge of reviewing, where a lot of people have to actually be hired to review every step of the process to release that information that people request through the Freedom of Information Act. So I think there's been one case, and I can't remember the details of it, but I remember reading about like one case where those checks and balances weren't really there, and some classified did get released with a FOIA request, but it is certainly not the norm. And there are thousands of requests processed regularly to protect that information, and also to protect the public's right to know and the right to understand what's going on. So, I think it's much less likely that something would be released than it would be that something might be retained that the public does actually have a right to. But that's just a swag.
No, thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I think I found your paper very interesting, your presentation. So thank you for everyone that joined us today. And thank you, Ms. Karambelas, and hope everyone has a great Friday and a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I look forward to the plenary session and getting back with everyone to see what everyone thought about the rest of the sessions. So yes. Thank you. Thanks for joining me.